No one dared oppose an arrogant judge, until Maid's daughter spoke. "Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. In a grand courthouse located in the heart of the city, the air was thick with power and authority. The polished marble floors reflected the light streaming through towering windows, casting an imposing glow over the courtroom. At the center of this domain stood Judge Samuel Montgomery, a man known for his cold demeanor and unyielding rulings. With a reputation that struck fear in the hearts of those who appeared before him, Judge Montgomery was a force to be reckoned with. His gavel echoed through the room, each strike signaling his dominance, and no one dared challenge him. He was a man of high status, wealthy beyond measure, and feared by many. He had built his career on making swift, often harsh, judgments that left little room for mercy. His reputation as a strict enforcer of the law had earned him respect among his peers, but it had also earned him enemies who feared his unrelenting approach to justice. The case that day was no different. A simple dispute over property rights had turned into a battle of wills, but Judge Montgomery had already made up his mind. As the lawyers presented their arguments, the tension in the room was palpable. The defendant, a humble maid, stood before the judge, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a piece of paper containing the details of her case. She had no legal training, no resources to hire a top-tier attorney, and yet she stood before the judge, hoping that somehow justice would prevail. Her daughter, a quiet girl of about 10, sat in the back of the courtroom, eyes wide with nervous anticipation. She had been told to stay out of sight, to remain unnoticed by the powerful men and women who filled the room. But little did anyone know, this innocent girl was about to change the course of the entire case. As the proceedings went on, the maid's daughter sat silently, her gaze never leaving the judge. She had been told to keep quiet, to remain invisible, just like her mother. But as the judge spoke, dismissing the maid's arguments with a wave of his hand, something stirred inside her. She could no longer remain silent. As Judge Montgomery read out his final decision, declaring the maid's case invalid and in favor of the wealthy plaintiff, the young girl could feel the injustice in the air. Without thinking, she stood up, her small voice cutting through the silence. "Excuse me, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. The room went still. Everyone turned to look at the child who dared to speak in the presence of such power. Judge Montgomery raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated by the interruption. "What is it, child?" he asked coldly. The maid's daughter took a deep breath, then spoke the words that would forever change the outcome of the case. "The evidence you're basing your decision on is incorrect. I can prove it." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as all eyes turned to the young girl. How could she, a mere child, possibly know something that the experienced lawyers had missed? And yet, there was something about her confidence that made them listen. The room was thick with tension as all eyes remained fixed on the young girl who had dared to speak. The judge, still perched at his imposing desk, looked down at her with an expression of disbelief. For a moment, the silence was deafening. The maid's daughter stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, but her words were steady. "I know the documents you have are not the right ones. There's an error in the paperwork that changes everything." Judge Montgomery narrowed his eyes, his patience wearing thin. He was used to being respected, to having his authority unquestioned. A child, no less, challenging his decision? It was unheard of. He took a deep breath and slammed his gavel down with authority, signaling for the room to settle. "And what do you think you can prove, little girl?" he sneered, clearly annoyed. The maid's daughter didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her small hand shaking slightly, but her voice remained calm. "The address on the documents is wrong," she said. "It's not the correct property. I saw the real papers hidden in the filing cabinet, and they prove that the land is actually owned by my mother, not the plaintiff." A murmur ran through the room. How could this child know such details? The lawyers, who had spent weeks preparing their cases, looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. Judge Montgomery, however, didn't share their surprise. He was dismissive, his gaze hardening as he prepared to silence the girl. "This is preposterous," he said. "You have no legal standing here. Go sit down before you make things worse." But the maid's daughter didn't back down. She had lived in a world of silence, always told to stay in the background, always told that her voice didn't matter. But today, in this moment, she found the courage to speak up, to defend her family, and to stand against an injustice that had been allowed to persist for far too long. "Please, Your Honor," she continued, her voice unwavering. "The truth is in those documents. I can show you where to find them." The room fell into an uncomfortable stillness as the judge stared at her, his pride bruised. He had never been questioned so boldly, especially not by someone so young. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before the judge finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Fine," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Show me." The maid's daughter nodded, her heart racing as she walked to the back of the room, her eyes scanning the shelves and filing cabinets. The courtroom was filled with a strange mixture of disbelief and curiosity as she reached for the drawer that held the original documents. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she also felt something else, hope. Hope that, against all odds, she might just be able to prove that justice could prevail, even in a world where the rich and powerful ruled. As she opened the drawer and pulled out the folder, the eyes of everyone in the room were on her. This was her moment, and she knew she couldn't afford to fail. With trembling hands, she laid the papers on the judge's desk, each one a testament to the truth she was about to reveal. The judge picked up the first document and examined it closely. His expression remained unchanged, but the tension in the air was palpable. He could no longer dismiss this girl as a mere child. As he sifted through the papers, something shifted in his demeanor. It was subtle, but it was there. The maid's daughter stood silently, watching him, waiting. For the first time, Judge Montgomery seemed uncertain. His fingers trembled slightly as he read through the documents, his arrogance slowly starting to crack. The room, once filled with the cold certainty of his judgment, now felt heavy with anticipation. The judge continued to examine the documents in front of him, his face becoming increasingly unreadable. The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. For the first time, the powerful Judge Montgomery was unsure. He flipped through the pages with precision, but his earlier confidence was gone. The maid's daughter stood at the back of the room, her hands clasped tightly together, her heart racing as she waited. Every second felt like an eternity. The lawyers, once confident in their case, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to speak. The judge set down the final document, his eyes lifting slowly to meet the maid's daughter. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "How did you know?" The young girl swallowed hard, but she didn't hesitate. "I saw it when I was cleaning. I was looking for something else, and I found the real paperwork hidden behind some old files." She glanced at her mother, who was standing quietly at the back of the room, eyes wide with a mix of pride and astonishment. "I didn't know it would help," the girl continued. "I just thought it was wrong. And when I saw the mistake, I knew I had to speak up." Judge Montgomery's face softened, a flicker of something human breaking through his earlier arrogance. For a moment, he seemed to forget the position of power he held, and the weight of his earlier decisions hung heavy on him. He looked around at the room, as if seeing it for the first time. The arrogance that had once defined him, the certainty that had made him untouchable, was now replaced by something new, doubt. He stood up slowly, his gavel in his hand, as if unsure of how to proceed. "This is unprecedented," he muttered to himself, pacing back and forth. The courtroom was still, every person waiting for the judge to make his next move. After a long pause, the judge turned toward the maid's daughter. "You've done something today that no one else would have dared. You've proven that the truth can never be silenced, no matter who tries to hide it." The room held its breath as the judge's words hung in the air. He turned back to the paperwork in front of him, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just learned. The powerful judge, who had once seemed invincible, was now forced to confront his own mistakes. He slammed his gavel down with a force that echoed through the room, signaling a moment of finality. "The case is reopened," he declared. "The real owner of this property is the maid's family, not the plaintiff. The ruling is overturned." A murmur of shock and disbelief rippled through the courtroom. The lawyers who had once been so sure of their victory were now left speechless. The maid's daughter, standing at the back of the room, felt a rush of relief wash over her. She had done it. She had exposed the truth. The judge, once so powerful, now seemed small in comparison to the courage of a child. For the first time, the maid's daughter felt like her voice mattered. She had stood up to an arrogant judge, a symbol of power and authority, and had proven that even the smallest voice could make a difference. As the judge looked at her, a newfound respect was evident in his eyes. The room was still buzzing with disbelief, but the maid's daughter knew that she had just changed everything. The courtroom was still, as if time itself had frozen in place. The maid's daughter stood there, her hands clasped tightly together, as the magnitude of the moment began to sink in. She had done it. She had challenged a man who had stood unchallenged for years, and she had won. But the weight of her actions had not fully hit her yet. As the judge stood at his bench, looking down at the overturned ruling, there was an air of uncertainty. He, too, seemed to be grappling with the consequences of his decision. Judge Montgomery had spent years holding the gavel of power, issuing verdicts that shaped lives. Today, however, he had seen the vulnerability of his own position. He had been forced to admit his mistake, a mistake that only a child had pointed out. "This is a lesson for us all," the judge finally said, his voice quieter than usual. His eyes, once cold and commanding, now seemed softer, almost apologetic. He turned toward the maid's daughter, his face revealing a rare vulnerability. "You've taught me something today, something I've forgotten in all my years of judging." The room remained silent, as if everyone was holding their breath. The maid's daughter could hardly believe what she was hearing. This was a man who had never shown mercy, who had never considered the people who stood before him as anything but subjects to be ruled over. Yet now, he was speaking to her, a child, with a respect that felt foreign but welcome. "I think we've all been blinded by power," Judge Montgomery continued, his voice carrying a quiet regret. "It's easy to forget that justice isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about listening, about understanding the truth, no matter who brings it to light." The maid's daughter felt a lump form in her throat. For so long, she had been invisible, the quiet child who was only ever in the background, cleaning up after others. Now, she had made a difference. She had made her voice heard. "Your Honor," she said softly, still in disbelief, "I didn't do it for me. I did it for my mom. She works so hard, and she deserves justice." The judge nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And you, young lady, have shown us all what real courage looks like." He looked around the room at the lawyers and the witnesses, whose eyes were now filled with something they hadn't shown before: respect. The judge's gavel came down with a finality that sent a ripple of silence through the courtroom. "The case is hereby dismissed," he declared. "The rightful owner of the property is the maid's family. The decision stands overturned." A gasp of disbelief spread through the room. The lawyers who had been so sure of their victory were now speechless. For the first time, it wasn't their voices that mattered, but the voice of a child. The maid's daughter's heart raced with relief, but there was something else too: pride. She had done something that no one thought was possible. The judge had listened, and he had changed his mind. As the room began to empty, people whispered about the case, about how a simple girl had taken on a powerful judge and emerged victorious. The maid's daughter walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Her mother, who had stood quietly by her side throughout the ordeal, smiled at her with tears in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered. "You made a difference." The maid's daughter smiled back, a sense of fulfillment settling in her heart. Today, she had not only changed the course of a case, but also changed the way she saw herself. No longer just the invisible girl in the background. She was someone who could make an impact, someone who could speak the truth, no matter the consequences. The days that followed the courtroom victory were filled with change, not just for the maid's daughter, but for the entire community. As the news of the overturned decision spread, it became the talk of the town. People who had once ignored the maid and her daughter began to see them differently. There was a new respect in the air, one that was hard to ignore. The maid's daughter, once just a shadow in the background, now walked with her head held high. She was no longer the quiet girl in the corner, invisible to the world. The courage she had shown in that courtroom had turned her into a symbol of strength. It wasn't just her victory, but the victory of everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or ignored. At home, her mother watched with pride as her daughter blossomed into someone who knew her worth. The maid's daughter was no longer just a helper in the background. She was a person with a voice that mattered, a person who could stand up for what was right, no matter how difficult the fight. For the first time, they didn't just see her as the maid's daughter. They saw her as an equal. In the weeks that followed, Judge Montgomery, too, was changed. The power he had held for so long seemed different now. It was no longer something to be wielded with arrogance or entitlement. The respect he once commanded was tempered by a humility he had never known. He began to question his past decisions, to reflect on the people he had judged so harshly. The maid's daughter's courage had forced him to look at the law and his role in it in a new light. He had always believed that the law was black and white, that justice was simple and absolute. But now, he understood that true justice required listening to the people, to understanding their stories, their struggles. For the first time, he saw the value in those who had no voice, the ones who were too often ignored. The once proud and unyielding judge had learned a lesson he would never forget. And it was all thanks to the bravery of a young girl who had the courage to speak the truth. As for the maid's daughter, she had proven that even the smallest voice could make a difference. Her victory was not just about winning a legal case. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against her. She had shown everyone, including herself, that courage could come from the most unexpected places. She had been underestimated, ignored, and dismissed. But in the end, it was her voice that changed everything. She had found her strength, and in doing so, she had helped others find theirs. The maid's daughter had become more than just a symbol of justice. She had become a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. Her story would be remembered, not just for the case she won, but for the way she inspired a community to rethink how they saw power, justice, and the value of every individual. In the weeks following the court decision, the maid's daughter became somewhat of a local hero. People who had once barely acknowledged her now stopped to greet her on the street. Her classmates, who had always kept their distance, now looked at her with newfound admiration. It was as if a shift had occurred in the way the world saw her. She had gone from the quiet girl in the corner to someone who commanded respect without even trying. The victory had been hers, yes, but it was also a victory for anyone who had ever been dismissed or forgotten. Her actions had given people hope, hope that the truth would always come to light, no matter how difficult it might seem. She had shown them that courage could come from the most unlikely places. At home, her mother, once a woman of quiet perseverance, now carried herself with an air of pride. She no longer saw herself just as a maid, a servant in the background. She saw herself as the mother of a girl who had made a difference in the world. The maid's daughter's courage had given her the strength to see her own worth. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream of a future where she wasn't just cleaning the homes of others, but could live a life of dignity and respect. The judge, too, had changed. He had spent many years in his position, issuing rulings that seemed so absolute, so final. But the maid's daughter had made him realize that the law, in its coldness, couldn't always be the only answer. He had learned, through her quiet bravery, that there was more to justice than simply following the rules. Sometimes, it meant listening to the people, understanding their lives, and seeing them as human beings, not just subjects to be judged. His reputation, once untouchable, had been shaken, but in a way that allowed him to grow. He found himself questioning his past decisions, wondering how many others had been overlooked in the pursuit of what he thought was fairness. The once powerful man now understood that true power didn't come from his gavel, but from his ability to listen, to recognize when something was wrong, and to make things right. In the months that followed, the maid's daughter's life slowly began to change. She was no longer just a bystander in her own life, watching as others made decisions for her. She was making her own path, one step at a time. Her mother, proud of everything her daughter had accomplished, began to speak up more at work, questioning the way she was treated by her employers. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. And together, they started to believe in a future that was different from the one they had known. The maid's daughter began to think about what she could do with her life. She had always loved reading, and now, she began to dream of a future where she could help others, just as she had helped her mother and their community. She started to visit the library more often, reading about law, justice, and the ways people could make a difference. Her dreams were no longer limited to cleaning houses and doing chores. She wanted to be someone who could make a real impact, someone who could fight for the voiceless. She knew it would be hard, but for the first time, she believed it was possible. The town had changed too. The once indifferent community now seemed more aware of the power of kindness, justice, and courage. People who had once looked down on the maid and her daughter now saw them as equals. The judge's own staff, who had once followed his orders without question, began to ask more questions themselves. The power of one voice had rippled out, changing not just the lives of a few, but the entire community. Months passed, and the impact of the maid's daughter's bravery rippled through the town in ways no one had anticipated. The town that had once been indifferent to the struggles of its working class had slowly begun to change. People were talking about justice in a new way, one where everyone's voice mattered, regardless of their background or social status. Her actions had ignited something deeper within the community. It was not just about her small victory in the courtroom anymore. It was about the realization that power should not be wielded with arrogance, and that true justice required understanding. The maid's daughter's life had also evolved in ways she never imagined. She began receiving offers for scholarships, and local organizations reached out to support her education. The librarian at her school, inspired by her courage, started to mentor her, guiding her through books on law, history, and human rights. For the first time, the maid's daughter felt like her dreams were not just dreams, but a reality she could actually reach. She spent hours at the library, studying cases of injustice that had been overturned by ordinary people who had spoken out. She started to see herself in those stories, realizing that she, too, had the power to make a difference. Her mother, once a woman who had quietly endured years of mistreatment and silence, began to change as well. She started standing up for herself in the workplace, speaking out against the unfair treatment she had endured for so long. It wasn't easy for her. Old habits die hard, and the world she had lived in for years had taught her to stay in the background, to remain unnoticed. But now, inspired by her daughter, she found herself taking those small steps toward asserting her own worth. The relationship between the two of them deepened in ways that they hadn't imagined. The maid's daughter had always looked up to her mother, seeing her as a pillar of strength, even in the face of hardship. Now, her mother was her greatest inspiration. Their bond became one of mutual respect and understanding, and together, they dreamed of a life where they were no longer invisible. But even as their lives improved, the journey was not without its challenges. There were still those who looked down on them, still whispers behind their backs. The road to true change was long, and the maid's daughter knew that their victory in court was just one step in a much larger fight. She often thought back to that day in the courtroom, when she had stood up to a powerful judge, exposing the flaws in the system that had once worked against them. She realized then that the battle wasn't just about one case, but about the fight for dignity and equality that would continue long after the gavel had fallen. The judge, too, had changed. After the ruling, he had spent a long time reflecting on his career, on the power he had once wielded with so much certainty. He began to reach out to legal professionals in the community, discussing the flaws in the system and how they could work to make the law more accessible to those who had long been marginalized. His transformation was not just about recognizing his mistakes. It was about actively working to make things right. He even met with the maid's daughter and her mother, acknowledging their courage and the lessons he had learned from them. It was a humbling experience for him, and one that gave him a new sense of purpose. He had once seen himself as a figure of authority, but now, he understood that true authority came from a deep sense of empathy, a willingness to listen, and a commitment to justice for all. As the town continued to change, so did the lives of the maid's daughter and her mother. They had become symbols of hope, not because of their circumstances, but because of their unwavering belief in justice and their willingness to fight for it. The community that had once overlooked them now looked up to them, and they had become a shining example of what could happen when a single voice spoke out against injustice. As the months passed, the town began to transform in ways no one could have predicted. What started as a single act of courage had sparked a wave of change that rippled through every corner of the community. People who once kept their heads down, accepting the world as it was, began to question the fairness of it all. The maid's daughter had shown them that it was possible to challenge the status quo, to stand up for what was right even when it seemed like the odds were insurmountable. Her bravery had ignited a spark of hope, not only in her own life, but in the lives of others. She had inspired a movement, one that wasn't driven by anger or revenge, but by a quiet determination to create a better world for everyone. Her mother, too, had changed. For years, she had endured the quiet suffering of being dismissed, invisible, always in the background. But now, she carried herself differently. She no longer accepted the mistreatment she had once endured, no longer stayed silent when injustice reared its head. She had become a voice for herself, for her daughter, and for anyone who had been overlooked. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of the world felt heavy, but she found strength in the lessons her daughter had taught her. One evening, as they sat together at their small kitchen table, the maid's daughter looked at her mother and said, "We're not invisible anymore." Her mother smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "No, we're not," she said. "And it's because of you." The maid's daughter smiled back, feeling a warmth she had never known before. She had changed her life, and in doing so, had changed her mother's life too. The world around them had started to look different, and for the first time in a long time, they both felt like they truly belonged. Judge Montgomery, too, had undergone a transformation. He had been a man of absolute power, a figure who had never doubted his own authority. But after the events of that day in the courtroom, he found himself questioning everything. The gavel that had once seemed like the ultimate tool of justice now felt heavy in his hand. He had been humbled by a young girl, a child who had shown him that true justice was not about authority, but about fairness, about seeing the people before you as equals. In the months that followed, Judge Montgomery began to shift the way he approached his work. He started listening more, questioning more, and considering the lives of the people who appeared before him. He didn't change overnight, but he began to take steps to ensure that his judgments were not just about the law, but about compassion and understanding. It wasn't easy for him to let go of the certainty he had once clung to, but he knew he had to if he wanted to truly serve justice. One day, he invited the maid's daughter and her mother to his chambers, asking them to sit with him as he reflected on what he had learned. "You've taught me more than you know," he said to the young girl. "Your courage has changed the way I see the world." The maid's daughter, who had once felt so small, now found herself in the presence of someone who had been her greatest adversary, but also, perhaps, her greatest teacher. "I didn't do it for you," she said softly. "I did it for my mom. For us. Because we deserve to be seen." The judge nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You're right," he said quietly. "And you've shown us all that it's not enough to simply follow the law. We must follow our hearts, too." The maid's daughter and her mother left the courthouse that day with a sense of peace, knowing that they had not only fought for justice, but had sparked a change in the world around them. Their journey wasn't over, but they were no longer fighting alone. Together, they had proven that one voice could make a difference, and that the courage to speak out could change the world. And with that, they walked into the future, no longer invisible, no longer silent, but strong and confident in their right to be heard. The years passed, and the changes sparked by the maid's daughter continued to shape the community. What had once been a town defined by its division of wealth and power, where the voices of the poor and marginalized were easily ignored, now began to feel different. The maid's daughter had not only earned the respect of those around her, but she had ignited a cultural shift that began to spread beyond the courtroom. People started to pay attention to those who had always been overlooked. They listened more carefully to the stories of their neighbors, understanding that each person's experiences were valuable and deserved to be heard. The maid's daughter continued to excel in her studies, fueled by the knowledge that the future she once thought was beyond her reach was now possible. She had earned a scholarship to a prestigious university, where she pursued law with the dream of one day becoming a lawyer who would fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. It was a long road ahead, but she knew that if she could take on a powerful judge and expose a broken system, she could accomplish anything. Her mother, too, had found her own strength. She continued to work, but she no longer accepted being invisible. At work, She advocated for fair treatment, ensuring that the rights of herself and her colleagues were respected. She had become a voice for the voiceless, a woman who had learned to speak up, not just for herself, but for all those around her. Her relationship with her daughter had deepened, and together, they continued to support each other, knowing that they had come from a place of silence, but now lived in a world where they were seen, heard, and respected. Judge Montgomery, too, continued to reflect on the lessons he had learned. His perspective on justice had changed, and he worked tirelessly to ensure that his future rulings were fair and impartial. He reached out to the community, holding town hall meetings where people from all walks of life could voice their concerns. He sought to use his position not to impose his power, but to listen and help enact change. He would never forget the lesson that the maid's daughter had taught him, the lesson that true justice was not about wielding power, but about serving the people. The town, once divided, had begun to heal. It was no longer a place where the powerful ruled unchecked, but a place where people came together, supported one another, and fought for fairness. And all of this was because of one child, who had spoken when no one else dared. She had stood up, not just for herself or her family, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. She had shown that no one was too small, too powerless, to make a difference. The story of the maid's daughter became a legacy, one that would inspire generations to come. Her bravery had created a ripple effect, changing the lives of everyone it touched. And as she stood at the threshold of her future, ready to take on whatever challenges came next, she knew that no matter how powerful the world around her seemed, she would always have the strength to speak the truth, to stand up for what was right, and to make a difference. In the world of millionaire stories, one tale stands out for its courage and determination. A young girl, who grew up in the shadows of wealth and power, stood up for what was right, challenging an arrogant judge and changing the lives of those around her. This story of injustice and courage reminds us that no matter the odds, one person can make a difference. As the maid's daughter exposed the flaws in the system, she became a symbol of hope, not just for her family, but for her entire community. Like many millionaire stories, her journey wasn't about the wealth she gained, but the strength she found in the face of adversity. This tale is more than just a courtroom drama. It's about finding your voice when the world tries to silence you. From the moment she stood up in court, the maid's daughter's actions sparked a ripple effect that would change her life forever. Her story shows us that true justice is not about power or money, but about standing up for what is right. In the end, it wasn't the judge or the wealthy that mattered, but the courage of a young girl who dared to speak the truth. Millionaire stories often focus on wealth and influence, but this is a reminder that true power lies in the ability to fight for justice, even when the world is against you. This story of resilience and hope is one that will inspire for years to come, proving that the most valuable thing you can have in life is the courage to speak out, regardless of your background or status.